Good morning to people from Israel. It's still morning there, and it's afternoon for us. Today, we have this special lecture by one of the prominent personalities who have been working with regard to the national security of Israel for a long time, titled as Aftermath and Lessons for Israel following the Operation Guardian of Walls. And regarding this particular operation, there were a lot of things that were spoken about because of 11 days of fighting. And what engulfed was very interesting. There are scholars who say that Israel's thinking during the fighting displayed some sort of a tactical quantitative logic, but whereas Hamas's thinking was much more strategic qualitative. Now, what is very clearly evident is the type of domestic discourse that happened. And now we see even the political change that's happening in Israel. And what exactly was Israel's strategy here? What it wanted to achieve? Was it about the number of Hamas terrorists killed, or the number of targets that they wanted to destroy, or number of rockets that being launched, and they wanted to prove to the world that this is what we have been facing day in and day out? And there are numerous tunnels that were pulverized. There were multi-storied buildings that were used about. There are scholars we heard last week, people like Noor Dahri, who mentioned that it's the Islamic Jihad that's much more powerful than Hamas. But Hamas seems to be having a greater voice, as well as being a primary concern for the state of Israel itself. Now, in this regard, what did IDF achieve, and what exactly are the lessons that it has drawn? We thought the better person to talk about this is Ms. Micky. Let me take the privilege of introducing her to the audience. Ms. Micky is a senior research fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, specializing in national security, international relations, and diplomacy. This is an institute that's been a great friend of India. Their president himself is a great friend of India, and it's a well-known factor. Her recent writings focus on international involvement in the Middle East and the impact on Israel's national security, regional developments such as Russia's evolving role in the Middle East. Prior to joining Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, Ms. Aharonson concluded nearly a decade of service at the National Security Council in the Israeli Prime Minister's office as a senior director of the Diplomatic Secretariat. In this role, she was responsible for managing the international relationships of the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor, including with foreign NSCs and diplomats. She regularly prepared policy recommendations for the Prime Minister and the National Security Advisor on regional and international affairs. Ms. Aharonson appears frequently in the Israeli and international press and advises companies and the NGOs on policy and development, which we have also seen in many of the videos in recent times. Before serving in the Prime Minister's office, she was a lecturer and researcher in international relations. So she is a perfect combination of a teacher, that means an international relations scholar, plus someone who's a practitioner who knows the in and out, being in the Prime Minister's office, being responsible for a lot of things that are associated with national security. Ms. Aharonson, we are extremely delighted to have you here, and thanks for having agreed to be on board. And we are also planning for certain cooperation with the institute that she belongs to. It's going to be a greater partnership that the Manipal Academy of Higher Education, specifically Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, is going to have. So without wasting much time, I will now request Ms. Micky to take over and deliver the lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kishore, for the very kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy for any dialogue with the Indian friends. I think every Israeli has a very warm sentiment towards India, whether he visited India already or not yet, but just planning to. So I will try to be brief. I will try to be concrete. I promise to be a bit blunt. And we will leave time for questions. I think that would focus the discussion wherever you prefer to take it. So first of all, let's talk about the facts. What happened in the Operation Guardian of the Walls? Basic facts: an outbreak of violence on May 10th this year, which lasted till May 21st. We had casualties. About 13 people were killed in Israel, 250 Palestinians were killed. 4,500 rockets were shot at Israel. 90% of the rockets that reached Israeli territory, and I'll explain later what I mean, were intercepted by Iron Dome system. IDF destroyed more than 100 kilometers of underground tunnels using to smuggle weapons into Gaza, what is known as the Metro. It struck 820 targets in Gaza. About 130 terrorists are gone. Approximately 500 rockets were shot by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad towards Israel. They fell inside, they landed in the Gaza Strip, resulting in Palestinian casualties. So, why did I decide even to write this with my colleague, Ayman Mansour? Because a new government was sworn in Israel on Sunday. One of the first challenges it would necessarily have to deal with is the Gaza Strip. Now, as Hamas behavior is not expected to change, we at least do not expect it to change much in the future, we would like to look for some lessons in order to avoid repeating the same mistakes and expect a different outcome. So what I'm offering is about a list of 9 lessons from the operation, and we can discuss if you have any further questions. So, lesson number 1, negotiate discreetly, but very, very early with a preferred mediator as soon as possible. Regionally, there were 2 contending parties that were attempting to reach a ceasefire. There were the Egyptians, who have been talking with both parties in previous escalations, with Israel and with Hamas. And there were the Qataris, who for years support Hamas by providing it with funds, either with Israeli consent or more covertly by facilitating money transfers. Now, despite Egypt's resentment, very hard resentment of Hamas being a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, the conflict in Gaza created a rare opportunity where the interest of Hamas and the interest of Egypt coincide. Hamas, they both have a common interest in ending, they had a common interest in ending the fighting, each one for its own reasons. Egypt sees every armed conflict between Israel and Hamas as endangering internal stability in Egypt and a potential trigger for internal unrest. Now, this derives from, yes, the contentious peace agreement with Israel, but also because the possibility could improve the position of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt itself. They are Cairo's arch enemy. But, and for the very same reason, Egypt does not mind the fact that Israel is giving Hamas a bloody nose sometimes. Now, Qatar, on the other hand, a patron of the Muslim Brotherhood, perceives the confrontation between Israel and Hamas as an opportunity to improve its own position as an international mediator, as a regional mediator, and also protect its client, Hamas. Now, the problem is that during this operation, at least not in the open, the efficiency of Egypt, and if anybody's interested, Qatar, was not put to test because since Hamas openly threatened Jerusalem, it could have helped if Israel would reach out very quickly to Egypt and try and assist in creating an Arab front against the Hamas-led escalation and prevent, or at least shorten, the 11-day armed conflict. Lesson number 2, don't be blackmailed, ever. Every time Hamas wanted to increase its cash flow, it started shooting at Israel. Now, Qatari money, Qatari cash, sometimes in suitcases, began to arrive openly to Gaza with Israel's consent in 2018. And this happened after a very, very hard bombardment of Israeli civilians by Hamas. Now, as Hamas realized its success, it repeated the same procedure. Every time it needed more cash, it would start bombing Israel, Israeli population, of course. Israel must demonstrate to Hamas that any breach, and I mean any breach of ceasefire, will be answered with a massive show of force, focusing on military installations, research and development facilities for military purposes, of course, rocket production factories, command and control centers, and political and military leadership. All the while adhering to the very strict principle the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, have been working very, very hard to try and preserve, which is preventing as much as possible, this is war, preventing as much as possible collateral damage. Lesson number 3, don't expect Hamas to keep its promises. Following another round of violence between Israel and Hamas, Operation Protective Edge in 2014, Hamas committed to stop smuggling weapons into the Gaza Strip and not to rebuild military infrastructure in exchange for Israel's agreement and assistance, actual assistance in rebuilding, in rehabilitating Gaza. Now, the ongoing barrages that we had since, I'm talking about Israeli civilians, not military, have proved, of course, otherwise. It should be taken into consideration that the justification for the existence of Hamas is the resistance, the violent resistance narrative, and it will do whatever it takes to pursue this narrative. Lesson number 4, explore opportunities to undermine Hamas. For years, Hezbollah in Lebanon, in the north of Israel, Hezbollah and Hamas were hostile, very hostile to each other, following the fact that Hamas supported Syrian Sunni opposition groups during the Syrian civil war. Hezbollah, on the other hand, fought on the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's side, and Hamas support for the Syrian opposition resulted in many casualties for Hezbollah. Israel, big mistake, did not exploit this opportunity in order to widen the rift between Hamas and Hezbollah, as it did not, another big mistake for Israel, it did not explore the possibility to reach some indirect understandings with Hezbollah via international law interlocutors like Russia, for example, who is present in all these arenas. Now, the benefits of such understandings, and I'm not talking about a peace agreement in any way, I'm talking about very limited understandings. From an Israeli perspective, the benefit would be quiet, really buying quiet along its northern border by setting a temporary yet very restrictive and clear rules of the game that would minimize provocations from Lebanon's territory, not from Lebanon, from Hezbollah in Lebanon's territory. And it would minimize the likelihood of Israel having to address two fronts at the same time, which is possible but very undesirable for Israel. Lesson number 5, don't take your regional partners for granted. When it comes to regional support, diplomatic efforts are required in order to foster cooperation. These include communication, mainly between senior decision makers, top decision makers, and regional partners in order to try and coordinate and explain policy. Not conducting, at least not publicly, such talks with overt, I'm mentioning specifically overt allies, like the United Arab Emirates, like Bahrain, like Morocco, during the recent round of fighting did not bode well for the formulation of a, I would say, pro-Israeli regional narrative, or for future cooperation in the security realm. I would like to mention a point in this context. The fact that Israel was able to cause a lot of damage to Hamas militarily is an incentive for regional partners to continue and cooperate with Israel on security and intelligence. Lesson number 6, don't take your friends' support for granted either. The United States, though in the beginning publishing a bit counterproductive, ambiguous messages at first, all sides are requested, it came out as a firm supporter of Israel by preventing anti-Israeli decision in the United Nations Security Council, by promising to renew Israeli arsenal of Iron Dome missiles, those who intercept Hamas rockets that were, by the way, originally planned and designed in Israel, and by stressing, first and foremost, Israel's right to self-defense. This should not be taken for granted. This should be nurtured, especially when in the background there are growing, not only, but mainly progressive calls in the Democratic Party to reevaluate the bipartisan support to Israel. In order to secure backing for future Israeli military efforts against Hamas, and there will be such efforts, we can discuss that later, in Gaza and against Hamas in the West Bank, Israel should also forge a common vision with the US on the required immediate steps for the very important strengthening of the Palestinian Authority and its very quickly eroding legitimacy among Palestinians. Lesson number 7, understand what hurts Hamas. For example, the Israeli electricity company, which provides electricity to Gaza, refused at first to risk their lives and fix electricity lines to the Gaza Strip in order to create an equation that says we will fix your electricity, and in return you have to return missing Israeli soldiers and civilians that are kept in Gaza, in prison. Now, this is footage of Gazans without electricity, civilian people in Gaza, is the best propaganda tool for Hamas. This is a higher priority for Hamas than helping their own people. Another example, during the fighting, a few days after the fighting, Israel agreed to open a crossing point in order to deliver humanitarian aid from Israel into Gaza. What did Hamas do? It bombed the crossing point the moment the trucks started crossing into Gaza. And moreover, I would say, the common narrative in Gaza, and for that matter also in the Palestinian Authority, in the West Bank and Jerusalem, is that Israel was defeated by Hamas. Now, I do not want to get into the question of who won. I don't believe it's a question of victory. It's a war of attrition and it will go on for a long time. But despite this narrative, which is, again, shared by the majority of Gazans, it's not this that will make Israel be hard or soft on Hamas. It's about understanding how Israel can really inflict pain to the organization, to the terror organization, first and foremost, with a focus on covert channels of funding, of finance for its military wing. Lesson number 8, we're almost reaching lesson number 9. So lesson number 8, kill two birds with one stone by severing any linkage between Hamas and Jerusalem and stressing the relevance of moderate Arab states to preserving the well-being of Muslim and Christian holy places in the city. Now, let me stress, also following what you, Dr. Kishore, said, this war by Hamas may be against Israel, but it is no less and even more against the Palestinian Authority. There were elections that were supposed to take place in June and in Palestine, both parts of it, I guess, that were cancelled. And Hamas had to stress its power and had to stress it is the protector of Jerusalem. It is the protector of Jerusalem more than the Palestinian Authority is. Now, you do not want to hear my opinion about letting the Muslim Brotherhood control the holy places of Jerusalem, and good luck to all of us who would like to visit that place, if God forbid this happens. But it is very important to notice that Hamas is fighting against the Palestinian Authority no less, maybe more, than it is fighting against Israel. Now, the moderate Arab states are highly important for Israel in the regional context, and they are highly sensitive to any change of status quo in Jerusalem. So what should Israel do? Israel should stress that Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan, as stated and agreed in the peace agreement from 1994, is the guardian of the Muslim holy places in the Holy Basin in Jerusalem. It is not Hamas, and for that matter, it is not the Palestinian Authority either. Egypt, Jordan, the UAE, Morocco, and others need to be portrayed to their internal, to their domestic audience as working to preserve and protect religious interests while Hamas is operating to harm them. And I would only mention the bombing of Jerusalem by Hamas, indiscriminate bombing of Jerusalem. Lesson number 9, my last lesson. Take initiative. Despite the decline in the regional importance of the Palestinian question over the past few years, the Gulf states apparently decided their national interest is more important than sacrificing it for years for others. This issue will not go away. It should be resolved, and it will continue to create tensions between Israel and its neighbors. Israel should not only respond to Palestinian and international actions, it should initiate measures that would first and foremost, and this is very important, improve the lives of Palestinians, of civilian Palestinians, and increase, and this is also very important for the future, the potential for future arrangements with the State of Israel. I think I'm done. I'm ready to take questions, and we can develop it from here.
Thank you, Ms. Micky Aharonson, and that's an excellent stride forward, as you promised that you would not mince words, that you will keep it black and white, and you would not hesitate to speak about it. I think it was very, very straightforward. And now I would open the floor for discussion. Those of you who have questions, please raise your hand, or you can as well text us, and then we will commence the Q&A. Be specific to the topic that she is talking. That would be very apt. That would be nice too. Okay, we have two of them. You want to take one by one, Ms. Micky, or how do you want?
Yeah, let's do one by one, if it's okay.
Mr. Manish Tripathi, please.
Yeah.
Unmute yourself and speak.
Yeah. Good morning, ma'am. Thanks for giving the step-by-steps learning from this particular episode. You are straightforward, and the learning that you have given has gone straight to our mind and provided the better understanding of the current crisis. My question is again very straight, as you like it. My question is, as far as Egypt is concerned, what is their #1 priority? Do they want to show their respect for the Palestinian and help them, or do they want to better their relationship with the USA by working for the welfare of Palestinians? What is the objective #1?
I'm sorry, just which party were you talking about? I couldn't hear you.
Now, as far as Egyptians are concerned, the level of democracy has come down, okay, and they want to have better relation with the USA. That is strategically very important. Now, as far as Palestinians are concerned, that relations is more of humanitarian in nature, regional in nature, or to some extent religious in nature. So what is more important from them? Why they are helping the Palestinian? To help them actually per se, or to impress and amend relation with the USA?
Okay.
Well, I believe, first of all, Egypt, even if it would want to, it cannot ignore the Gaza question. And when we're talking about Palestinians, I would break it into two, because which Palestinians? Palestinians in the West Bank or Palestinians in Gaza? It's a totally different regime. And as I said, they confront each other, and no less than they confront Israel. So again, Egypt also has Gaza on its border, and it has to deal with it, whether it wants to or not. I believe Egypt wants also to lead regionally, as it should, as a stabilizing factor. And of course, I'm sure they would want to continue and improve their relations with Egypt. I believe, again, some Western choices were very questionable to me, because when General Al-Sisi did come to power in a military coup, he was deposing the Muslim Brotherhood. He wasn't deposing the followers of Mother Teresa. And the response of the US was to stop, to withhold a very big military deal and aid with Egypt. And of course, there's no void, there's no lacuna. The Russians immediately poured in and signed if I remember correctly, a $3.4 billion defense deal. So I think Egypt is facing a huge crisis in terms of its population, and we Israelis, as a 9 million country people, it's even hard to perceive the challenges that Egypt is facing. But it seems that Israel and Egypt have the same interests in the Palestinian aspect, and we have very good cooperation with them. We have solid cooperation with them, and God willing, this would also turn into peace between people and people, because there's no reason why not.
Thank you. Ashok, Dr. Ashok.
Well, good morning, ma'am. Thank you for your wonderful lecture. My question is that in spite of having one of the best intelligence units across the world, the best spy agency in the world is Mossad, why you are not still able to destroy the terror infrastructure of Hamas? And also, I would like to know how efficient is the Iron Dome system, which protects your country? And if you don't mind, I'm asking you one last question. How, during the crisis with the Palestinians, how do you see the uprising of the Israeli Arabs? How patriotic they were during this crisis?
These are three excellent questions. These are three excellent questions, and I will start with the technical one, since I am not a technical expert. Israel has been investing billions in creating layers of defense for its people, because we know it's a long war of attrition, as I said, and it could be from south, it could be from north, and Israel is doing really everything. And as we speak, new technologies are being developed to protect the civilian population of Israel. Now, the Iron Dome, in this operation, the number is 90% of launching that fell in the Israeli, inside Israel. And again, about 500 rockets fell inside the Gaza Strip, killing their own people. But from the rockets that were launched towards Israel, about 90% were intercepted. This is not to say that there was a failure of 10%. This is to say that if we know that the rocket is about to fall in the sea, we will not waste a very expensive rocket to try and to intercept it. Let it fall in the sea. So this is about the technical part of Iron Dome. About Israeli intelligence, and here I would like to be modest and realistic. Of course, I would like to say we have the best intelligence. I don't know, but it is impossible to have good, extremely good intelligence if you are not inside the territory. In 2005, Israel left the Gaza Strip, and since then, intelligence was gathered, but not from within. There are no Israeli soldiers in the Gaza Strip. Now, I hear that there are very brave Israeli generals that say we should go into Gaza, we should dissect it into 3 parts. This is very brave of them, and I'm mocking this, of course, because I object it completely. We were there already. What happened? We had more casualties when there was Israeli presence inside the Gaza Strip. However, you have to admit, if we know there is a warehouse with 200 rockets, and so Israel can bomb it and get rid of it, in order to get rid of Hamas infrastructure completely, you have to have a ground entry into the Gaza Strip. And I'm happy to say that there is no support, there is a very small support for this, a very minority support for this by the Israeli public and by the Israeli government, the old one and the new one. So we have to know our limitations. There is a way, like was done by other countries, in Syria, for example, to completely demolish Hamas infrastructure. This is of complete indiscriminate bombing. Israel will never do that, and I'm happy to say that. But we are facing a situation with limited intelligence and limited ability to act, especially if we want to preserve the principle of trying and prevent as much as possible collateral damage. Now, I don't know if this audience is aware of the extreme efforts the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, are doing to prevent this such collateral damage. There are practices like calling and sending text messages to people in buildings so they evacuate them before bombing. There are limited bombing of buildings. It's called knock on the roof. You take off the top of the building and people leave, and only then you demolish the whole building. So as long as Israel will continue to preserve this principle, and I hope and I'm confident it will, we will have to deal with Hamas, and we will have to deal with a long war of attrition, and with the fact that they are constantly sending bombs and rockets to our population. The last question was about, I think, the Arab population of Israel, if I'm correct.
Yes, the Arab population of Israel.
To me, this question is more dangerous for Israel's national security than Hamas. We know how to deal with Hamas. We're not going to just, flip a finger and finish with the problem, but we know how to deal with him. And the problem was that these, the people that came rioting in the streets, and they were, by the way, not only Arab population, it was also extreme Jewish population. We have to take note of that. The Arab population was not the general Arab population. The majority of the Arab population in Israel demonstrated that it is interested and willing to be part of the state of Israel and to have to be part of life in Israel. The people that came out to the streets, the gangs that came out to the streets, were mainly young people, unemployed, outlaws, with enormous access to weapons, and thousands and thousands of weapons. But I think the people it was thousands of people. You know what? Let's say tens of thousands of people, but not more than that. And these are young people who do not listen to their parents, and they're not listening to the heads of their community. And it's not an organized crime like we're used to hear about in the US or in Italy. It's outlaws that are the desperate young men who are looking for, I would say, action. And it is very, very unfair to put them in the same basket with the general Arab population that was indeed interested in peace and quiet and raising their families in peace. What is my suggestion? The Israeli government has to speak to the heads of the Arab community and improve their living standards, improve their infrastructure, provide more employment possibilities, so less and less youngsters would be drawn to those outlaws protesting against Israel.
Thank you,
very much.
Ms. Rashmi Ramesh.
Thank you for your lecture, Ms. Micky. It was really interesting. I have two questions. First one, there's a new prime minister in Israel. Any changes in the nuances as to how they're going to deal with Hamas, in your opinion, especially with regards to the 9 lessons that you pointed out? So that's my first question. The second one is, this is essentially an Arab cause, right? I mean, Arabs are more concerned about this. How do you think the role of Turkey and Iran have evolved, and especially in the recent conflict that we saw? These two are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll start with the pessimistic question, with your permission, which is the second one. During the fighting, the leaders of Hamas came out in public and thanked Iran for its support of the resistance in terms of providing weapons that are smuggled into the Gaza Strip. So this involvement is very clear. The Iranians actually sent an armed drone into the territory of Israel. My interpretation is it was a symbolic act. I don't believe the Iranians have an interest now to provoke Israel into an all-out war. But they needed to do something. They needed to do something that would prove they are supporting the resistance, they're supporting their clients in the Gaza Strip. So I think no surprises there, and it was contained. And in general, we saw also from Lebanon we saw some protests. A guy was trying to cross the border and he got killed from Lebanon into Israel protesting. There were marches, there were demonstrations, but there wasn't something significant. Hezbollah in the north did not open, and he made sure we understand he's not interested in doing so, in opening a second front. Now, this is very important because it demonstrates that when Hamas is fighting Israel, Hezbollah will not necessarily join in. But I am confident that if Hamas would immediately move in. So in that sense, and I'm being very, very careful with my definitions here, it's positive that this operation took place right now because Hamas, I think, is weakened militarily, not the motivation. Hamas is weakened for a long time now, and if something starts happening in the north of Israel, it's going to be very hard for him to create a significant problem for Israel. So again, no, but it was contained, it was symbolic, we could live with it. Turkey, Israel has no problem with Turkey. The Israeli people have no problem with the Turkish people. We had extremely good relations. There was a problem with the head of Turkey who came out and has very interesting remarks about both Israelis and Jews that should be noted by the international community, and they are. He came out suggesting an international force would go right into Israel, Gaza, and protect the Gazans. I guess he would protect them. He meant he would protect them from shooting the 4,500 rockets at Israel. But Turkey, again, under Erdogan, has a very destructive role in that sense. It is supportive of Hamas. It is hosting Hamas. It is very, very much involved in Jerusalem, in our capital. It is operating through different societies, welfare societies. I actually criticize the government of Israel for allowing them to do that, because I think there are very few nations in the world, if at all, that would allow another nation, very, very, at least linguistically hostile towards Israel, to be involved like this in its capital. But, you know, life is probably stronger than any political interest of any leader, because economic relations between Israel and Turkey have been flourishing. They are on the rise, and unless I think this issue of Hamas would be politically lucrative for Erdogan, there is absolutely no dispute between Israel and Turkey. Now, reaching the more positive question of the new Israeli Prime Minister. We have a new government. There was a sense of euphoria in Israel on Sunday when the government was finally sworn in. Not in a very pleasant procedure, but I guess this is bargaining, this is politics. And people here are very hopeful. And I hope that at least some of the lessons that are recommended would be adopted by our new leadership. I'm very hopeful, but time will tell.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Anand.
Yes, thank you for a very pointed kind of giving us a very pointed understanding about Israel's lessons which it has learned from this particular exercise. I just wanted to ask you about what Israel thinks about India's stance. For instance, about the UNHRC, the resolution where it abstained. We know that India and Israel for a past few years have been getting increasingly close. But what is the Israeli feeling about where India is going, especially with this recent move? And then I have another question, and this is from one of my students. She has put it in the chat box. Kripa Susan Varghese. She has said that she wanted to ask, there are a few Jewish communities that support the Palestinian cause. Does it signify any sort of support given to Hamas and its activities? So that's,
let me start from the second question. Yes, there are Jewish communities that support Palestinians. I believe, except for you can count them on one hand. I'm exaggerating maybe, but I don't know of any Jewish communities that support Hamas. They support the Palestinians, but they are talking about the Palestinian Authority and those that are able to talk to Israel, that want to make peace with it and not send and not throw rockets at its population. So this distinction needs to be made. There is Hamas and there's the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority, and this is supported by most Israelis, needs to be strengthened, needs to be nurtured. People there we understand they want, the majority of course, they want peace, they want to live their lives. And it is not a coincidence that what is known as the Arab Spring did not happen in the Palestinian Authority, because they see what is happening around them. They see what is happening in Syria, and they see what is happening in Tunisia, the attempt in Egypt. And I don't know of a single person who would want to live his life like this. So again, and as I said in one of my lessons, the Palestinian Authority needs to be strengthened. Its people, its population deserves a better life. And I hope maybe now under the new government, this would be possible. And sometime in the future, maybe we could reach an agreement. I could call it peace agreement, I could call it an arrangement, but some sort of agreement that would provide for two states that can live peace by each other in peace. I don't know about Gaza. I'm not talking now about the civilian population. I don't see any hope for the Muslim Brotherhood of Hamas. Again, this will be a long war of attrition. They know it, we know it, and we are prepared for it. Regarding the question about Israel's perception of India, again, I'm not a government official right now. I can only speak from my perspective. Israel has expectations from India in terms of supporting it, for example, in international fora, of course, like the United Nations. But I think we appreciate our friendship with India, and we understand that India has other concerns and other priorities, and we understand that you're not only dealing with Israel the whole day, of course. I think Israel understands the sensitivities that India has to go through when it raises its hand in the United Nations. Again, this is a very good test for the relations. The relations are excellent. I mean, we have cooperation in so many fields. And I think it will only grow. And I believe it will grow because of two reasons. First of all, there is a true friendship between the people. I don't know of a single person, I think a single family whose member has not visited India or wants to return again, including myself. But there is also the question of national interest. I believe if we bring the Abraham Accords into the picture, the chance for more countries to join the Abraham Accords would be according to a single test. Did the countries that joined the Abraham Accords profited from joining them, or would they be better off? I'm not talking in terms of money, of course. Or would they be better off if they hadn't joined? I believe, I'm also very optimistic. I believe more countries in the region, in the Middle East, I hope more Muslim countries beyond the Middle East would join the Abraham Accords, because again, they have to put their national interest at the top, and their national interest would be to have good relations with Israel, who is very much interested, very much open, and it's a win-win. I don't think anybody could lose from that.
Thank you. Group Captain Chandrasekharan.
Yeah, a brilliant presentation, ma'am. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Yeah. You spoke about spending millions on the Iron Dome. The Hamas have got rockets which are extremely rudimentary and which is not very, very costly. And now they kept firing so many rockets, and you had to use an expensive air defense system to block those rockets hitting the targets. Hamas is effectively bleeding you economically by making you spend millions, whereas they are spending only a few thousands. That is one. That is my question. The cost factor, I think, is weighing heavily against Israel. The second question is, I thought Iran was watching the entire proceedings very closely to find out whether they'll be able to improve the systems to penetrate the Israeli air defenses. If you can throw some light on that, ma'am. Thank you.
Luckily, I'm not a technical expert, so I can avoid some parts of your question. Your first observation is extremely correct. And it's not only a question of money, it's a question of motivation. We invest huge part of our budget in defense. We understand this is the way it was, and we understand this is the way it's going to be. I hope it can be diminished, but no, Israel invests, again, billions in defending its population. And again, Israeli army is not called Israeli army, it's called Israeli Defense Forces, IDF. And it will continue to invest as much as required in not only building military countermeasures like Iron Dome, but also we have shelters, we have protection systems, and we have other systems than Iron Dome that are designed for different challenges that Israel may face. It will continue to do so. We are fighting, it's not an equal fight because, you know, some of the more significant weapons that Hamas used in the last years are explosive balloons. You know, balloons that are, you have to see children in the south of Israel. Children rejoice when they see balloons, not the children in the south of Israel. If they see colorful balloons, they start screaming and they are intimidated because they are sending explosive balloons into Israel in the hope of, first, of course, intimidating the population and creating fires. It's a very hot country. It's very easy to set a fire. So, and it's very, very cheap. Now, Israel faces a question how much it is willing to do against it. Would it just start shooting anybody to prevent this? If there's identification of terrorists that are about to send balloons into Israel. And again, let me stress, these are explosive balloons. If you touch them, you're dead. So this has to be, and Israel is developing technological measures, I would say, to prevent these balloons from reaching the ground. They're costing us a lot of money. I think with all the flourishing of Israel in terms of economy, in terms of science, it could have done even better. But that's the environment we live in. We're not in Switzerland, and I don't think it will change. Not because Israel is really an enemy, because Israel is a very good justification for those people to push their agenda. I'm sorry, could you please repeat your question about Iran? I want to be very precise.
I think Iran was observing this entire proceedings very carefully. Won't they be planning to effectively improve their missile system to penetrate your Iron Dome or air defense system?
Well, you should ask somebody who's sitting in Tehran, I think. But I am sure, I give them the credit that they are super smart and super intelligent, and I'm sure they've been following very carefully. The problem with the boycott, with the sanctions on Iran, that they have been improving their military capabilities gradually, with the help of some nations like the Russians. They've been improving, they've been progressing, and I can only very carefully, and I'm here, read between the lines, please. I hope that Israel is able to defend itself, very costly though, but against challenges coming from Iran.
Thank you.
I think you got my point.
Yeah, I did. Thank you.
Yeah, we have a PhD scholar, Mr. Nadeem Ahmed. Go ahead, Nadeem.
Hi, I'll keep my question very short. As you know, the Iran nuclear talks are ongoing in Vienna, and I think Washington may be indicating on extending some concessions to facilitate a nuclear deal. This could very well be sanctions relief, as Tehran has been asking for a sanctions relief on a lot of its assets. So, will Israel support any form of sanctions relief to Iran, and how do you think any sanctions relief at this point would further strengthen Hamas, especially after Naftali Bennett coming to power. I mean, we have heard Naftali Bennett speaking for a long time all about his rhetorics, but I'm really curious to know what exactly would be the stance of Israel at this point in time, and how the Biden administration perhaps would take into consideration the call from Israel. Thank you.
Well, the alternate Prime Minister of Israel, the currently Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, said Israel will not allow Hamas to have nuclear weapons. Of course, he did not elaborate. As far as I understand, the JCPOA, the agreement, is a done deal. The Americans have made very clear to the Iranians they are more interested in signing it than the Iranians need it. So I think it's a done deal. In a nutshell, I think it's a very bad deal because it leaves the nuclear issue not to the capacity of the Iranians, but to their goodwill. It's not a question if they can develop nuclear weapons, it's a question if they are willing to develop nuclear weapons. And they have expressed very impressive capacities in doing so. So I think we have to start from this point, and it's not very popular maybe to say it here in Israel, but again, I imagine the JCPOA would be rejoined and sanctions would be lowered. We saw from previous experience that when in 2015, when the JCPOA was signed, the money that started pouring into Iran did not go to the people of Iran. It went to the resistance, and it went to Hezbollah, and it went to Hamas. And I think the Iranian people are very upset about it, justly so. If I could be certain, it's not the Iranian the people of Iran deserve a better life. Again, also, Israel and the people of Iran have no dispute. We don't have a shared border. We have no dispute. We used to have very good relations. But I have no doubt that once the money starts pouring in, the people with the guns would get their share first. And maybe not just their share, maybe everything. And they are corrupt. They are motivated. We see the people who will be who are running for elections in Iran. And also, it's not a question of election, it's a question of selection, because the supreme leader and the council, they approve the nominees to begin with. So I'm not very hopeful in that sense. I wish there would be a more moderate leader who would be able to take the funds that already arrived to Iran and that will arrive to Iran and use it for the benefit of the Iranian people and not Hezbollah and not Hamas. But here, I'm sorry, I'm pessimistic.
Thank you. Sri Kutan is our master student.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am, for the lecture. Those were very straightforward. So I have a question that is regarding like one of the points you said. So you stressed on how there needs to be cooperation and dialogue, so negotiations. So like in light of this one, I would like to ask you, the recent conflict or the recent acceleration of the conflict happened due to the incident that happened in Sheikh Jarrah, the verdict that came and the happenings that followed. But if we see the statements from UN, they have been very scathing. There have been very scathing remarks, and the CHR spokesperson said that this would amount to like war crimes, and you are like violating your own obligations under the international law. And they have urged you to stop such kind of activities because this would further deteriorate rather than building the relations. So how do you see this kind of actions? Because like according to the UN itself, those areas belong to the Palestinians. So you have been also described, the statements called as occupation. So you have been described as occupying those areas. So how do you think that this kind of activities or such actions will won't it dampen the negotiation attempts and like rather not build trust but cause further conflict? What is your take on that, ma'am? Thank you.
I hope I understood your question correctly. I will try to answer it. If I'm not precise, please correct me and ask again. There was a protest that started in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood because 6 families were expected to have a jurisdictional decision that would tell them to leave their homes. Meanwhile, it was postponed because some people acted responsibly. The decision was postponed. And apparently there was throwing of stones from the Temple Mount, and the police, the Israeli police, raided in, making a lot of arrests, and it raided into the Temple Mount. I criticize this decision. I think it was unwise, although I believe in crushing every show of violence. I believe this was unwise. And I do hope that there would be a responsible government here who would be very careful and not doing the right thing, but doing the smart thing. I do have to say again that I think Hamas took excellent advantage of the situation, trying to appear as the protector of Jerusalem and the protector of the holy places,